Well, hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to this session of the Great Books program, one of my favorite courses at Ubiquity, where, as you know, each month we take one of the books, great books of human literature, and explore various aspects of the truths and the challenges that they represent. I started last month on Erik Hoffer's book, The True Believer. And this month, I will conclude those remarks. I want to first take note of world events, because I think what's happening in the Middle East is such a perfect example of virtually everything that Erik Hoffer is talking about in terms of mass movements and what goes in to a mass movement. And so I'll lay out sort of some of the aspects of the contemporary drama, and then I'll summarize what we discussed last month, and then dive in to the part that we will focus in on this month and conclude our session. As you all know, I am sure, several days ago on October 7th, Hamas launched an attack on Israel that was in some ways a long time coming, but which took the Israelis completely by surprise. Extraordinary thing. The vaunted intelligence capacity of the Israelis, the asymmetry between the super state of Israel and the small non-state of Gaza, and the several thousand at the most militia that are involved with Hamas, was as if it wasn't just David and Goliath. It was as if David was a little dwarf. That would be a good way to think of the asymmetry between Hamas and the state of Israel. And nevertheless, beginning at dawn on October 7th, 2023, Hamas launched an attack on Israel of unprecedented proportions that was really the Israeli equivalent of 9/11 in the United States, where in that case, a non-state actor, a small, motley group of no more than several thousand mujahideen in the Middle East, under the auspices of Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda network, were able to come to the United States, hijack airplanes, and destroy the two World Trade Towers, and damage the Pentagon in Washington. Extraordinary act of military coordination, which, like what happened to Israel on October 7th, 2023, caught the Americans by complete surprise. And in the shock that followed that event, like the shock that is now reverberating around Israel, Israel vowed, like the United States, to completely root out terrorism in the Middle East and destroy Al-Qaeda. And what we have seen is that Al-Qaeda was not destroyed, but ISIS grew up in its wake, and several other mujahideen groups. The United States, after spending countless trillions of dollars in attacking Afghanistan and then Iraq, was defeated in both cases and left in the wake of those wars hundreds of thousands dead, both countries in ruins, tens of millions of refugees and displaced persons, and absolutely no resolution to the original reason why they invaded in the first place, particularly in Afghanistan. They found Taliban there when they invaded in the fall of 2001. And here we are in 2023 when the US ignominiously retreated and the Taliban took power again. Same thing is going to happen in Israel. Israel now will mobilize all its might and main and go into Gaza to eliminate Hamas. And they will fail, as they failed for 75 years, to eradicate the Palestinian resistance. Because what we're dealing with are mass movements. And mass movements cannot be defeated by war, because they're living organisms that actually feed on war, like cancer cells feed on weak and damaged cells in the body. And so the importance of Erik Hoffer's book on the true believer is that he goes into the psychodynamics of what produces mass movements. Because if you think about how history has changed over time, it has been mass movements more than any other phenomenon that have transformed history. And mass movements can take many shapes and sizes. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all started as mass movements. And to a certain degree, they remain mass movements to the present day. The French Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the Iranian Revolution, the Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, the rise of the Nazis were all mass movements. Hamas is a mass movement. Israel is a mass movement. So understanding the social and historical and psychological interactivities that create mass movements and empower them over time is a very important for us to consider. And so what I would like to do over the next 45 minutes or so is first review what we covered last time. A mass movement is a strange phenomenon, as Erik Hoffer reminds us. A mass movement is created in the fertile ground of discontent. when individuals en masse come together around a certain hope for the future that enables their discontent and their self-contempt to amalgamate around an ideology that always has an enemy to defeat. And I'm going to get into that in a moment. But I want to just review some of the things that I brought to the fore in the lecture last month. When people engage in social change, it is at a particular time and it attracts a particular demographic. So the classic example was the French Revolution. You have centuries of oppression. When the serfs in France under Louis XIV were so repressed, there was nowhere to look but up. And as Hoffer points out, it's not the abject poor that ever revolt. It is the poor who've recently experienced an upgrade in their standard of living, which activates the hope that it can change for the better, and the discontent that the change isn't happening fast enough. That's the fertile ground of revolution, where there's an experience of freedom, but there aren't the palliatives of their discontent. So that's a very important aspect of mass movements. They come from a certain kind of people that join in because they're feeling discontent. Hoffer says to a significant degree, emanating out of self-contempt. That's a very important second characteristic, that the revolution attracts people on the margins, the misfits, the heretics, the criminals, people that are part of the system, but they don't buy into the system. And, you know, the classic work on this was the Nobel Prize winning author in Nigeria, and I forget his name now, but he wrote a book, The Sinner Doesn't Hold. And it was the story of how the missionaries came to the village in Western Nigeria. And as a little boy, he watched how they operated. And the people that began to convert to Christianity weren't the elites, were not the farmers, weren't the householders. It was the outcasts. It was the handicapped. It was those people who in some way or another didn't fit into the social norms of traditional Nigerian village life that began to become attracted to the missionaries' message. And then as they began to create a critical mass, other people began to join in. But the mass movements always start at the margins. They end up at the center. But they start with those elements of society who, for whatever sets of reasons, don't fit in, but then experience some kind of elevation, and then off they go. Another aspect of mass movements is that they coalesce usually around a charismatic leader that has this peculiar capacity of channeling the discontent, focalizing on an enemy, mobilizing the psychic dynamic of animating a sense of empowerment and leading the charge. And look at the great religions, whether it's Moses or Jesus or Muhammad. Look at the French Revolution, Robespierre storming the Bastille. Obviously, the Adolf Hitler with the Nazis, Lenin with the Bolsheviks, Mao Zedong. It's generally associated with some kind of demagogue that rises up and is able to focalize this energy and this discontent in a way that people find empowering. Now, I want to turn and I want to follow the text, because one of the things that I brought out last lecture is one of the reasons why I loved Hoffer when I first read him, when I was only 15 years old, was the clarity of his language. You read Hegel or you read Kant or Heidegger, you have no idea what they're talking about. You got to read a commentary just to put it in English that you can understand. Even if you're a PhD, who can understand Heidegger? Erik Hoffer was a longshoreman. He was a working class man, and he wrote very, very clearly. So I'm going to just make some comments on some of the things that he said. The one is that though they seem at opposite poles, fanatics of all kinds are actually crowded together and are almost exactly the same. You think of Hitler or Stalin, or you think of Mao and Chiang Kai-shek, or you think of Trump and other fanatics. According to Erik Hoffer, whatever your ideology, they're all the same. It is the fanatic and the moderate who are poles apart, not one fanatic and another fanatic. And, one of my professors when I was at Harvard was a guy named Ralph Potter. And he had what he called Potter's box. And it was sort of like a horseshoe. And so you have the extreme left and the extreme right. And then you go up the horseshoe and you get to the moderates. And then you come down the other side. And we typically think that, well, if you want to get the guy from the extreme right to get to the left, you got to work him up the horseshoe and over. That's not how it works. A fanatic will change sides instantly without losing his fanaticism. And there's all kinds of examples in history of that. And in fact, the fanatics of various hues eye each other with suspicions and are ready to fly at each other's throat, but they're actually neighbors and almost of one family. They hate each other with the hatred of brothers. They are as far apart and as close together as Saul and Paul, if you remember your New Testament history. And it is easier for a fanatic communist to be converted to fascism, chauvinism, or Catholicism than to become a sober liberal. And I just find that's a fascinating way to think about some of the fanaticism. So there's not much difference between Hamas and the Likud party, you know, the ultra right-wing fascist in Israel and the ultra right-wing fascist in Hamas. They're all the same. They hate each other, but they're of the same cloth. And that's important in understanding some of the complexities. And one of the reasons why in the situation as it's unfolding right now, it is not helpful to take sides and to believe that the Hamas is the terrorist, but the Israelis are not. They're both terrorists. Hamas just happens to be small, non-state terrorism. They're killing, you know, civilians by the hundreds. And Israel, which is a state terrorist, which has the capacity of killing civilians by the tens of thousands, as it's going to proceed to do in Gaza. But the mentality of the terrorist is exactly the same. The other point that I'd like to take up is that the issue of unifying agents, what brings everything together. And I want to focus, as I said last time, on the issue of hate. There is more hatred right now between the Palestinians and the Israelis than at any time in history. And that hatred spilled out in Hamas's attack on October 7th. And that hatred is going to now spill out as Israel takes its revenge. And if Hamas took a little finger, Israel's going to take an entire arm, maybe the torso of the Palestinians, such is their hatred of the Palestinians. And when the defense minister of Israel said they're nothing but animals, he was speaking from his viscera. So you can imagine what they're now going to do to Gaza. I want to unpack why this is so. Why is this so? And this is the brilliance of Hoffer. It's one of the most important books I think anybody can read in the world today, right now. Hatred, he says, is the most accessible and comprehensive of all unifying agents. It pulls and whirls the individual away from his own self, makes him oblivious of his will and future, frees him of jealousies and self-seeking, He becomes an anonymous particle quivering with a craving to fuse and coalesce with his like into one flaming mass. Heine, great German philosopher, 19th century, suggests that what Christian love cannot do is affected by a common hatred. You know, we always say in the comfortable, liberal salons that love conquers all. Love is the most powerful. And I wonder whether that's true. You know, Dostoevsky in The Brothers Karamazov has a line that is deeply, deeply provocative. He says, "And he loved me with his hate. And that was the greatest love there is." He loved me with his hate. And that was the greatest love there is. And then Hoffer makes the point that mass movements can rise and spread without a belief in God. But they cannot rise and spread without a belief in the devil. And think about it. There's not a mass movement I know of that didn't have a devil as a core organizing principle. When Hitler was asked whether he thought the Jews should be destroyed, he said, "No, we should have to invent them. It is essential," he said, "to have a tangible enemy, not merely an abstract one." And if you look at all the mass movements, they all have very carefully defined enemies, so that common hatred unites the most heterogeneous elements. And I won't go into detail around that, but I want to just now tease out some of the salient aspects of Hoffer's treatment of hatred that are so applicable to what's going on in the Middle East right now, in Ukraine, in the United States, around the world, where you see hatred between the Muslims and the Hindus, in India, between the Republicans and the Democrats, and the white supremacists and Black Lives Matter. There's hatred on both sides. Let's unpack that. The puzzling thing, he says, is that when our hatred does not spring from a visible grievance and does not seem justified, the desire for allies becomes more pressing. An expression of desperate effort to suppress an awareness of our inadequacy, worthlessness, guilt, and other shortcomings of the self are the well springs of our need for allies in our hatred. Self-contempt is here transmuted into hatred of others, and there is a most determined and persistent effort to mask this switch. Obviously, the most effective way of doing this is to find others, as many as possible, who hate as we do. Here, more than anywhere else, we need general consent. Now, let's just unpack that for a moment. Immediately, Israel looked for affirmation of the fact that it's now going to clobber Gaza. Hamas received affirmation from Hezbollah, who launched their own attacks from Lebanon and Iran and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. So whenever you engage in hatred of an enemy, you need allies. You want allies. And in fact, you need allies, said Hoffman, to the inverse proportion of the grievance that you've actually suffered. And that's worth contemplating. And we're going to go deeper, so I'm going to save that for a moment. But then he says, what that brings up is the relationship between hatred and a guilty conscience. We know what we're doing is wrong. And that's why we want others to tell us that what we're doing is right. There is perhaps no sure way of infecting ourselves with virulent hatred toward a person than by doing him a grave injustice. The others have a just grievance against us is a more potent reason for hating them than that we have a just grievance against them. We do not make people humble and meek when we show them their guilt and cause them to be ashamed of themselves. We are much more likely to stir their arrogance and rouse them in a reckless aggressiveness. Self-righteousness is a loud din raised to drown the voice of guilt within us. There is a guilty conscience behind every brazen word and act and behind every manifestation of self-righteousness. Just think about that. There is a guilty conscience behind every brazen word and act and behind every manifestation of self-righteousness. And to wrong those that we hate is to add fuel to our hatred. Conversely, to treat an enemy with magnanimity is to blunt our hatred for him. Now, I want to just unpack that for a second. That underneath all hatred is a guilty conscience. And that in fact, behind the deepening of hatred and the manifestation of self-righteousness is an awareness that we've done wrong. Let's take the United States. Think about manifest destiny as we went from sea to shining sea. The more Indians we killed, the more Africans we enslaved, the more violence we perpetrated against the environment, the more lofty our rhetoric about being a light on the hill and God's answer to human history and the greatest power in the history of the world, the beacon of democracy to the world, the light to the world, till finally, the more violence America has perpetrated against the world. And there's been no empire in history that has perpetrated more violence against other people and the world, against the environment, than the United States. And that's why after 75 years of US hegemony over the planet, we are at the point of self-destruction. But the rhetoric of America is so lofty, and we've deluded ourselves so completely that we talk regularly in the corridors of power in Washington about it being the greatest nation in the history of the world. So whenever you hear the vaunted language of defending democracy, like in defending Ukraine, we're safeguarding civilization, et cetera, it's hiding a vast crime that you're not acknowledging about yourself and then projecting your self-contempt onto an enemy and then justifying more violence against the enemy. And so the more violence you perpetrate against the enemy, the deeper your hatred becomes, and catalyzing greater and greater rhetoric about how right you are to be killing these people en masse. I mean, take that in, everyone. We like to think that the hatred is a manipulation of the elites. It is not. The Germans were Hitler's willing executioners. The Americans are the willing executioners. En masse, they killed the Indians, the Native Americans. En masse, they enslaved Africans. En masse, they supported the war in Vietnam and Afghanistan and Iraq, Ukraine. And now they're supporting en masse Israel's carnage against Gaza and the West Bank. And the deeper the hatred, the greater the self-righteousness, and the more everybody has to hang together. And that's what Carl Jung called mass hysteria. When you have perfectly rational, conventional, individual people, but collectively they're engaging in something like the Holocaust or supporting nuclear weapons or destroying the environment, which when looked at it from a distance can only be judged to be completely insane. That's mass hysteria. Just think of your reactions right now. We're going in around the Middle East. Hamas is the terrorists. We got to get them. You're being caught up in that psychic infection of hatred. In Ukraine, Russia's the enemy. We've got to support the Ukrainians down to the last Ukrainian, and takes nuclear weapons. We're going to destroy the place. You know, we're willing to destroy the village in order to save it. That's the toxicity of hatred in a mass formation. Now, this is a deep point as well. It is startling to see, says Hoffer, how the oppressed almost invariably shape themselves in the image of their hated oppressors. That the evil men do lives after them is partly due to the fact that those who have reason to hate the evil most shape themselves after the evil they hate, and thus perpetuate it. It is obvious that the influence of the fanatic is bound to be out of all proportion to his abilities, both by converting and antagonizing. He shapes the world in his own image. Fanatic Christianity put its imprint upon the ancient world, both by gaining adherents and by evoking in its pagan opponents a strange fervor and a new ruthlessness. Hitler imposed himself upon the world, both by promoting Nazism and by forcing the democracies to become zealous, intolerant, and ruthless. Thus, though hatred is a convenient instrument for mobilizing a community for defense, it does not, in the long run, listen to this, come cheap. Hatred is very expensive. We pay for it by losing all or many of the values we set out at the beginning to defend. I just want to reflect on this for a moment. It is startling to see how the oppressed almost invariably shape themselves in the image of their hatred oppressors. The classic example is that of the state of Israel and the Zionist movement. Here you have 2,000 years of anti-Semitism in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe. Pogroms, massacres, persecutions, expulsions, everything imaginable, concluding with the Holocaust. And out of this, Zionism was born, beginning with Theodor Herzl's tract in 1898. We've got to create our own homeland. They established the state of Israel, and what do they do to the Palestinians? They do exactly to the Palestinians what the Europeans for 2,000 years did to the Jews. They expropriated the land, and Herzl's great line, the Jews are a people without a homeland, and the Palestinians, Palestine is a homeland without a people. So in the very first instance, from the very beginning, the Jews did not accord to the Palestinians equal humanity. And that is the genesis of the devil formation in the psyche. It's the subordination of other human beings as the defense. They're just animals. I've lived in Israel. I spent a year in Israel at the University of Tel Aviv, and almost without exception, all the Israelis, the Jews, would say that the Palestinians were, they referred to them as our cousins, the dirty Arabs. So over the last century, starting in 1915 and then accentuated in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration, Jews have been going into Palestine and expelling the Palestinians. That's how Gaza was created. 75% of the people in Gaza were the refugees when after the Second World War, the Israelis with British and American support expelled through extraordinary means hundreds of thousands of Palestinians so that they could create the state of Israel. They had to expel the Palestinians. Many of them went into Jordan, but many of them went to Gaza. And for the last 75 years, Gaza has been an open air concentration camp, which is a term coined by one of the Israeli parliamentarians, because that's exactly what it is. It's a prison camp. It's 20 miles by 5 miles. It's barricaded. They don't allow enough food or trade to get in by design. 50% of the Gaza population are now children. 75% of the population are unemployed. They have no way, because they're just in a concentration camp. And now the Israelis are going to bomb them to smithereens. And they've been doing that for 75 years. They've created an apartheid state. The Israelis have created in Palestine the very thing that they were subjected to in Europe. You see this time and time again. The Bolsheviks in Russia, espousing freedom, peace, bread. Those were the slogans of the Bolsheviks. Once they get into power, they became worse than the Romanov dynasty. Same thing after the French Revolution. They overthrow the old regime, and then they became worse than the old regime. And finally comes Napoleon Bonaparte. That was an emperor just like Louis XIV. It's a strange thing. I'm going to read it again. It's startling, says Hoffer, to see how the oppressed almost invariably shape themselves in the image of their hated oppressors. And then you got Hamas, which grew out of the oppression of the Palestinians by Israel. And now they're acting just like the Israelis, fueled by hatred, born out of this toxic melange of self-contempt and self-righteousness, which needs allies to perpetuate the momentum. Amazing when you really look at world events from the standpoint of what I would call deep history and deep awareness, like you see with Hoffer. And in fact, Hitler was completely understood this, by the way. And in fact, he said that it is of the utmost importance that National Socialism, the Nazis, should seek and deserve the violent hatred of all their enemies. That hatred is important to sustain the energy of the Nazis, that they actually, in fact, should be hated. You see this in Israel and Hamas. They need the hatred of the other side to justify their own atrocities against each other. Just think if Hamas, there was some Gandhi figure, and they were engaging in massive civil disobedience, completely nonviolent civil disobedience. It'd be a completely different story. The hatred of the Israelis would be revealed for what it is. But it takes a Gandhi who is one of the rarest of human beings and leaders in all of history. Martin Luther King. How many people can you name in all of history, East or West, ancient or modern, that understood the power of nonviolence. You can count them on one hand. And there aren't too many beyond Gandhi and Martin Luther King of note. The best yardstick for the value of his attitude and the sincerity of his convictions, said Hitler. This is a quote. And the force of his will is the hostility that he receives from the enemy. That's why Gandhi and Martin Luther King are such avatars. Because in the face of this truth, they were able to transmute that into love and nonviolence and a willingness to absorb in their own bodies the violence of the enemy. Oh boy, I can see we're running out of time here, so I'll just make one last point. Yeah, one interesting point. The estrangement from the self, without which there can be neither selflessness nor full assimilation of the individual into a compact whole, produces a proclivity for passionate attitudes, including passionate hatred. The act of self-denial seems to confer on us the right to be harsh and merciless toward others. The impression somehow prevails that the true believer, particularly the religious individual, is a humble person. The truth is that the surrendering and humbling of the self breeds pride and arrogance. The true believer is apt to see himself as one of the chosen, salt of the earth, the light of the world, a prince disguised in meekness, who is destined to inherit the earth. And there's also this, he says, when we renounce the self and become part of a compact whole, this is important. We not only renounce personal advantage, but we also rid ourselves of personal responsibility. That's why hatred is so destructive. There is no telling to what extremes of cruelty and ruthlessness a man will go when he is freed from the fears and hesitations and doubts and vague stirrings of decency that go with individual judgment. We find what Dostoevsky calls the right to dishonor. Again, Hitler. Any violence which does not spring from a firm spiritual base will be wavering and uncertain. It lacks the stability which can only rest in a fanatical outlook. As Renan says, we have never, since the beginning of the world, heard of a merciful nation. And so this is the final point that I want to make. That when we hate, part of the self-righteousness, part of the self-contempt, part of the enemy formation is a freeing of ourselves from any ethical norms. And that's why Hamas could go into a rave concert in the Negev and kill all those people. That's why in retaliation, the Israeli the Air Force went into Gaza, and the first thing that they took out was one of the big apartment buildings, knowing they were killing probably hundreds of people, innocent people. And then they took out a mosque. Because when you're caught up in the hatred that fuels a mass movement, you free yourself of any morality. And you can destroy the village in order to save it without a qualm of conscience. Because you've become a psychotic. So what we're seeing in the Middle East is a psychosis on both sides. What we're seeing in Ukraine is mass psychosis on all sides. And the abyss of psychosis, when morality is unhinged, and hatred and enemy formation and self-contempt and self-righteousness all come together. Everybody links arms and goes off the cliff together. It's out of that orgy of the psyche and the orgy of the soul that the self-destruction is then brought down. And then finally, as we saw with the Nazis, in the end, Hitler blows his own brains out, because he had accomplished his unconscious objective of unleashing violence that ultimately is self-consuming. And then there was nothing left to do but to put a gun through the roof of his mouth and pull the trigger. And that's going to happen in the Middle East. That happened in the United States and Vietnam, in Afghanistan and Iraq. You go in with all your self-righteousness and you leave completely defeated and a failure. So there's more that one can say, but I wanted to tease out these particular aspects of a mass movement, in the hopes that those of you who are listening to this presentation will be more aware when you hear the news and you hear who the enemy is and who the terrorist is, and they have committed of innocent victims, bring down the might of the war machine on the enemy, that this is happening at such a deep level that it's worth paying attention and freeing yourself from participating at all in a justification of the carnage that you're being asked to legitimize. So anyway, that's enough from me. I'll now turn it over to the participants. I want to hear from all of you. Just raise your hands, those of you who want to talk, and happy to engage with any and all of you in any way. Okay, here we got to get our graduate students here. Surely you haven't been struck silent by this presentation. There's a lot of meat here. So this is a meaty issue, but it's a big one. It kind of overwhelms the mind when one really thinks about the depths to which the human psyche has fallen when you have situations like we have in the Middle East. Okay, Tally Rhodes has raised her hand. So Tally, welcome, and
Thank you, Jim.
please say whatever you would like.
One of the things I've observed over the last 20 years is the impact in America of the 9/11, of the 9/11. It was such a big deal when it occurred, and I've just been devastated to see that many of the qualities that we said we were fighting against, I now see in terms of our own lack of tolerance with each other. So
Yeah.
That's what I wanted to talk about. I mean, I loved your point about the oppressed shape themselves in the image of the oppressor. And all throughout this, it really tied back to your presentation last month about, the sense of power, the discontent
Yeah.
leading to the sense of power, leading to the
Yeah.
charismatic leader. I find it super interesting that it's not mainstream, that you have like fringe society that actually is the catalyst of mass movements. I'm going to have to think on that a little bit because it's quite, I never knew that before.
Yeah, that's an interesting notion of the pathway, and by the way, that doesn't pertain just to mass movements. If you listen to Clayton Christensen in the corporate sector, he gives the classic example of the 1950s and 1960s, the big three automakers. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler were all making these great, big, huge cars. And when the Japanese economy recovered from the Second World War, they started to make little cars. And they were out in the margins. And Detroit said, we don't care. They're just little cars. Our profit margin on the little cars is too small. We're going to keep making big cars. Well, guess what? 50 years later, Japan was the dominant automaker in the world, and the U.S. automakers were on the brink of bankruptcy because they didn't see that what was on the margins was going to move into the center. So this is psychodynamic of change generally. It doesn't always only pertain to mass movements. And I would just also take up another point that you were making about 9/11. And after 9/11, America has become more and more of what it was wanting to fight against. I mean, and look at the Patriot Act. Look at the security. I'm in Washington. When I was here in Washington in the 70s, I worked at the National Jesuit Conference in 1978. Then I was here again in 1980. You walked into the Congress, you walked into the Supreme Court. I think they may have had a little metal detector. I don't recall, but we, the people, were welcomed into the Capitol. When I came last weekend, my office is right by the Supreme Court. You look over to the Capitol building, and it is like a military fort. You can't get anywhere near the Capitol. And there's special passes and special permissions, and it's no longer the people's house.
Right. Fundamentalism altogether. We were supposed to be very tolerant, and we just got so fundamentalist. Now you have these huge, you have the white supremacist, and I'm sure that you could take it from every angle. We all tend to think, well, this one's really evil and this one's really fair. But I'm saddened and want to participate in making a difference to what where we're headed, because I didn't, in the late 1990s, I thought global society was going to be wonderful, and I am distraught at the way it's headed. I never would have imagined that we'd head this way as a species.
Yeah. And look at all the mass shootings. There's a relationship between the United States being in perpetual war externally and the fact that we're now in perpetual war internally, including the mass slaughter of civilians on a regular basis. Around 2 a day is the average. And we don't do anything to solve the gun crisis. So as Hoffer says, the price that you pay for hatred is that you become the enemy that you want to overcome. And so he said, hatred is not cheap. There's a very high price. And we're seeing it all around the world today. And Erik Hoffer is a prime example of what that is all about. So thank you for your comments, Tally. Now, is there anybody else that wants to make any comment before we bring this to a close? Well, I would certainly welcome all of you to read Erik Hoffer and bear in mind my lectures as you witness the news and be more scrutinous thereby. So I guess we'll close out for today, and I would say that what we want to do is prepare then for next month in November and December. I'll also be giving the lectures for November and December, and I've chosen the book by Richard Dolan called After Disclosure. That's going to be around the UFO issue, now called the unidentified anomalous phenomena. Is why I'm in Washington, as you probably all know, is to work on this disclosure by the US government that the extraterrestrials are in fact real. They've been on planet Earth, and there's evidence of contact that the US government is now going to divulge to the world public. So I thought Richard Dolan's book, After Disclosure, where he talks about the world after disclosure, would be a good way to bring light on this subject and close out our year. So thank you, everyone. I appreciate your time and attention on these weighty matters. And remember what I've said very often about what makes a great book great is it's dealing with issues of gravitas that challenge us to think more deeply and feel more deeply about who we are and how we want to be in our increasingly volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. Thank you, everyone. See you next month. Bye for now.